Hi. I'm Charlotte Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and until a few months ago, I honestly believed that no matter how badly your family hurt you, blood would always be thicker than betrayal. I was wrong. Because the people I trusted most didn't just lie to me. They stole my name, my future, and almost everything I'd spent my entire life building. What they didn't know was that I had one secret they never saw coming. The night my father showed up at my penthouse, he didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I'd been. He dropped a leather folder on my kitchen island, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "Wire $5 million before tomorrow morning, or you'll destroy this family." I thought he was joking, until I opened the folder and saw my own signature, perfectly forged, on documents guaranteeing debts I'd never even heard of. I smiled. Not because I was calm. Because in that exact moment, I realized something. My family had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. People love saying that success changes people. It doesn't. Success simply reveals who always expected to own it. I grew up in Lake Forest, Illinois, in a house so large visitors called it a mansion before stepping inside. To everyone else, my father, Richard Bennett, was the definition of the American dream. Self-made, respected, a businessman whose face appeared in magazines beside politicians and charity boards. At home, he ruled differently. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. Every compliment carried conditions. Every mistake became a debt. My younger brother, Ethan, never had to earn forgiveness. He simply received it. He was charming, funny, always chasing another big opportunity. Whenever one failed, Dad called him ambitious. Whenever I questioned anything, I was called difficult. Mom tried to protect me. She'd whisper, "Charlotte, never let people convince you that love has to be earned." I didn't understand those words until years after she passed away. After Mom died, everything changed. The house became quieter. Dinner conversations disappeared. Only expectations remained. Dad stopped asking what I wanted. He started telling me what the family needed. I worked through college on scholarships, internships, and nights so long I sometimes slept in my car between classes. Meanwhile, Dad bought Ethan a new Porsche. He called it an investment in confidence. When I graduated from business school, I had exactly $83 in my checking account. No family money. No inheritance. No shortcuts. Just exhaustion. And ambition. 12 years later, I owned one of Chicago's fastest-growing financial consulting firms. My clients included Fortune 500 executives, professional athletes, and entrepreneurs trusted with hundreds of millions of dollars. People assumed my life was glamorous. Private drivers, luxury penthouse, designer clothes. The truth? I still woke up before sunrise every day. Still reviewed every contract myself. Still remembered what it felt like to count every dollar. Success never made me feel rich. It only made me useful again. Because every few months, Dad would call. Never to ask if I was happy. Never to ask if I was healthy. Always, "Charlotte, the family needs a favor." And somehow, that favor always came with another wire transfer. Another guarantee. Another sacrifice. I told myself it was temporary. That someday, things would finally be different. I had no idea. That someday was only 48 hours away. That cold Thursday evening, the Chicago skyline shimmered outside my apartment windows while snow drifted silently across the streets below. I had just finished reviewing a merger agreement worth nearly $200 million. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, closed my laptop, and enjoyed something I'd almost forgotten existed. Silence. Then, 3 sharp knocks echoed through my penthouse. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Confident. Demanding. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, my father stood there. Perfect suit. Expensive overcoat. Polished shoes untouched by the snow. In one hand, a dark leather folder. In the other, absolute certainty that I would say yes. Without waiting for permission, he walked inside, set the folder on my marble kitchen island, looked directly into my eyes, and quietly said, "We have a problem." He slid the folder toward me. "You're going to fix it." I reached for the folder, not knowing that everything inside it was about to destroy the family I'd spent my entire life trying to save. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My eyes stayed fixed on the bottom of the page. There it was. Charlotte Bennett. Written in smooth, confident handwriting. Almost identical to mine. Almost. Most people never notice the little things. The way I cross the letter T. The slight curve in my capital B. The tiny space I always leave before my last name. I noticed. Because it wasn't my signature. It was a forgery. A very expensive forgery. I slowly turned the page. Another loan agreement. Another guarantee. Another forged signature. Then another. Then another. By the time I reached the last page, my name had been used to guarantee more than $5 million in private loans. I looked up at my father. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't ashamed. He looked impatient. "As you can see," he said calmly, "it's become complicated." Complicated? I let out a quiet laugh. "You forged my signature." It wasn't personal. I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "You weren't available," he replied, as though he were explaining a delayed dinner reservation. "The bank needed proof immediately. We knew you'd understand." "We?" He nodded toward the hallway. Right on cue. The front door opened. My younger brother, Ethan, walked in. His expensive coat hung loosely over his shoulders. His smile disappeared the second he saw the documents spread across my kitchen island. "Charlotte." "I didn't know he was coming," I interrupted. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "It got out of control." "How?" Silence. Dad answered instead. "Ethan invested in a commercial real estate project." I asked Ethan. Dad frowned. The market shifted. I looked back at my brother. His eyes dropped to the floor. Finally, he whispered the truth. "I borrowed against future contracts." "How much?" Another silence. "Tell her," Dad ordered. Ethan swallowed. "Almost 30 million. The room felt colder. $30 million. Gone. Not because of bad luck. Because of greed. I slowly closed the folder. "So your solution," I said quietly, "was identity fraud?" Dad leaned against my kitchen counter. "It sounds worse than it is." I stared at him. "You committed a felony. We protected the family." "No." I shook my head. "You protected Ethan." His jaw tightened. "He's your brother. And I'm your daughter." Another silence. One I'd waited my entire life to hear. Dad finally looked away. Not because he agreed. Because he had no answer. Ethan stepped toward me. "We'll fix this." "How?" I'll make the money back. You've been saying that since college. His shoulders dropped. For the first time, he looked less like the golden child, and more like a frightened man who had never been forced to face consequences. Dad wasn't interested in consequences. He wanted obedience. Tomorrow morning, he said firmly, you'll wire the money. No. He frowned. I wasn't asking. I know. I smiled politely. And I still said no. The expression on his face changed instantly. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. As if the word no didn't belong in any sentence spoken to him. You owe this family. I owe this family? My voice stayed calm. I paid Ethan's college tuition. Neither of them spoke. I paid for his first house. Silence. I paid off his gambling debts when he said they were business expenses. Ethan closed his eyes. I invested in Dad's foundation. Nothing. I even covered Mom's medical bills because you said cash flow was tight. Dad's face hardened. Don't bring your mother into this. No. I met his eyes. For once. I'm going to bring everything into this. The room became painfully quiet. Dad picked up the folder. You'll regret embarrassing us. I walked to my front door. Opened it. And waited. He looked at me. Are you throwing me out? No. I answered softly. I'm giving you something you've never given me. And what's that? A choice. For several seconds. Neither of us moved. Then he grabbed the folder. Turned around. And walked out. Ethan stopped beside me before leaving. I'm sorry, he whispered. I looked at him. No. You're sorry you got caught. His eyes filled with tears. But I closed the door before he could answer. The lock clicked. For the first time in years. That sound didn't feel lonely. It felt safe. I walked back to the kitchen. The folder was gone. But one document remained. A single sheet of paper. Apparently forgotten in the rush. At the top was the logo of Bennett Capital Holdings. Below it. A list of assets. Buildings. Investment funds. Private accounts. Then my eyes stopped on one line. Emergency share transfer agreement. I frowned. According to the document, someone had quietly transferred 51% voting control of Bennett Capital Holdings. Months ago. But the new owner's name had been blacked out. Someone already controlled the company. And my father had no idea who it was. I picked up my phone. There was only one person I trusted. My name is Claire, she answered after one ring. I need you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. How serious is it? I looked again at the mysterious document. Then quietly replied. I think my father's biggest secret is about to become mine. I barely slept that night. The document stayed on my kitchen island while Chicago's skyline slowly disappeared into darkness. One question kept repeating in my mind. Who owned 51% of Bennett Capital Holdings? It couldn't be my father. He would never give up control willingly. And if someone else had taken control, why hadn't they used it? At exactly 7:30 the next morning, I walked into Claire's office. She had already spread copies of the documents across a long conference table. Claire adjusted her glasses and looked at me. Charlotte. These loan documents are criminal. I know. But this. She tapped the share transfer agreement. Is much bigger. I sat down. What did you find? She took a slow breath. I searched every public filing. Nothing. I checked private corporate records. Nothing. Then I requested the sealed succession documents. My heart skipped. And? Claire looked directly into my eyes. The transfer happened 3 months after your mother died. My chest tightened. My mother? She nodded. She created a private trust years before she became sick. I stared at her. That's impossible. Apparently. Claire slid another folder toward me. She knew exactly what she was doing. Inside was a copy of my mother's handwritten instructions. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the letter. It began with 6 words I hadn't heard in years. My beautiful Charlotte. Tears blurred the page before I read another sentence. If you're reading this, your father has finally chosen control over love. I covered my mouth. It felt like she was sitting beside me. She wrote about watching Dad become more obsessed with power every year. She wrote about protecting Ethan even when he made terrible decisions. She wrote about seeing me quietly carry burdens that were never mine. Then I reached the final paragraph. I cannot stop what your father may become. But I can make sure you always have the power to stop him. If that day ever comes, don't seek revenge. Seek freedom. At the bottom. Her signature. And beneath it. The name of the trust. The Charlotte Bennett Legacy Trust. Claire smiled for the first time all morning. Charlotte. You own the company. I couldn't speak. You've owned 51% of Bennett Capital Holdings for almost 10 years. My eyes widened. What? Your mother made sure the ownership stayed hidden until it became legally necessary. So. Claire nodded. Your father has been running a company. That legally belongs to you. The room fell completely silent. Every childhood memory suddenly made sense. Every time Dad insisted everything was his. Every time Mom quietly told me. One day the truth will matter more than power. She already knew. She had planned for this. Claire handed me one final envelope. There's more. Inside was a list of board members. 7 names. 5 of them had been personally selected by my mother years ago. None of them answered to my father anymore. They answered to me. Claire folded her hands. So. What do you want to do? I looked out the window toward downtown Chicago. For years I had imagined destroying my father's empire. Now. I realized something. If I acted out of anger, I'd become exactly like him. No public fight, I said quietly. Claire raised an eyebrow. You surprise me. I don't want revenge. What do you want? I smiled. I want accountability. She nodded. I'll arrange an emergency board meeting. Not yet. I stood. First, I want every financial record from the last 5 years. Every transfer. Every hidden account. Every shell company. Claire smiled. I already requested them. I laughed for the first time in days. I knew there was a reason I hired you. That afternoon, while my father competently prepared another meeting with investors, he had no idea that a forensic accounting team had already entered company headquarters. Quietly. Legally. With my authorization. No announcements. No headlines. No drama. Just professionals collecting facts. At 5:12 p.m., Claire called again. They found something. What is it? She hesitated. Charlotte. The forged signatures weren't just yours. I froze. What do you mean? There are dozens. Former employees. Retired partners. Even one deceased shareholder. The investigation had just uncovered something far bigger than family betrayal. It wasn't one crime. It was a pattern. And for the first time in his career, Richard Bennett wasn't facing an angry daughter. He was about to face the law. The following Monday began like every other Monday in my father's world. Black coffee. Tailored navy suit. A chauffeured car waiting outside the mansion at exactly 7:15 a.m. Richard Bennett believed routine was power. What he didn't know was that every minute of his routine had already been quietly rewritten. At 8:40, Claire texted me. "Everyone is here." I looked out over Lake Michigan from my office window. For years, I had avoided this moment. Not because I was afraid of my father, but because I still hoped he would become the man I needed him to be. Hope is a dangerous thing, especially when it's built on someone else's potential instead of their actions. I stood, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the elevator. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor of Bennett Capital Holdings. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. The same room where my father had made billion-dollar decisions. And countless personal ones, including deciding which child deserved saving. When the elevator doors opened, every conversation stopped. 7 board members sat around the polished walnut table. Some smiled politely. Others looked nervous. Claire stood beside the large screen at the front of the room. My father sat confidently at the head of the table. Without looking up from his phone, he said, "You're late, Charlotte." I didn't answer. Instead, I walked past him, all the way to the opposite end of the table. The chair reserved for the majority shareholder. My chair. I pulled it back, sat down, and folded my hands. Dad finally looked up. "What are you doing?" Claire placed a blue folder in front of every board member. "Mr. Bennett." She spoke calmly. "Today's meeting has been called by the majority owner of Bennett Capital Holdings." Dad frowned. "I'm the majority owner." Claire slid one final document toward him. "No. You haven't been. For almost 10 years. His face lost all color. He stared at the papers. His hand stopped moving. "This," he whispered, "is impossible." Claire remained perfectly calm. "The ownership transfer was executed by your late wife through the Charlotte Bennett Legacy Trust." Silence. One of the board members quietly cleared his throat. Another adjusted his glasses. No one looked at my father. Everyone looked at me. Dad slowly lifted his eyes. "You knew?" "I found out 4 days ago." "And you're doing this?" "No." I answered softly. "Mom did." His jaw tightened. "She had no right." The oldest board member finally spoke. "Actually, she had every legal right." Dad pushed his chair back so hard it struck the wall. "This meeting is over." "No," I said. "It's just beginning." Claire pressed a button. The large screen behind her came alive. A timeline appeared. 5 years of financial records. Shell companies. Hidden accounts. Unauthorized transfers. Loan guarantees. Every transaction carefully documented. The room became so quiet. Even the air conditioner sounded loud. Claire spoke one sentence at a time. Over the last 5 years, corporate funds were diverted into privately controlled entities. Click. Another slide. Multiple personal debts were disguised as business investments. Click. Another slide. Several loan agreements contained signatures now confirmed by handwriting experts to be forged. Dad stood frozen. "This is ridiculous." Claire didn't react. "The evidence has already been submitted to outside auditors." Another click. The final slide appeared. Total unauthorized financial exposure. $48.7 million. Someone at the far end of the table whispered, "My God." Dad finally looked directly at me. "You planned this." I shook my head. "No. You planned it." The day you decided my name belonged to you. For the first time in my entire life. He looked small. Not because he had lost money. Because he had lost certainty. One board member raised his hand. I move that Richard Bennett be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Another voice answered. I second the motion. Dad looked around the room. You're all making a mistake. No one responded. Claire distributed voting cards. One by one. The board voted. 6 in favor. 1 opposed. The motion passed. Just like that. The man who had controlled every room he entered no longer controlled this one. A security officer quietly entered through the side door. Professional. Respectful. Mr. Bennett. If you'll come with me. Dad didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on mine. You'll regret humiliating your own father. I met his gaze without anger. I didn't humiliate you. You did that yourself. For a long moment. Neither of us spoke. Then he picked up his briefcase. Straightened his tie. And walked toward the door. Just before leaving. He stopped. Without turning around, he asked. Did your mother really think you'd choose the company over me? My voice was barely above a whisper. No. She believed I'd finally choose myself. The door closed behind him. The sound echoed through the boardroom. Not like an ending. Like the first honest beginning our family had ever known. I looked around the table. The directors waited for instructions. For years, they'd waited for Richard Bennett. Now, they were waiting for me. I took a slow breath. First order of business. I said. We're going to tell the truth. At that exact moment, Claire's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Then looked at me. Charlotte. The FBI just contacted our legal team. They want copies of everything. The room fell silent again. Because this had just stopped being a family crisis. It had become a federal investigation. By Tuesday morning, every major business newspaper in Chicago carried the same headline. Bennett Capital faces internal investigation. The articles were careful. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just facts. An independent audit. Leadership placed on administrative leave. Outside investigators reviewing financial records. Exactly the way I wanted it. No public revenge. Only the truth. For the first time in years. I walked into the office without feeling like I was carrying my family's secrets on my back. Claire met me in the lobby. The FBI arrived 20 minutes ago. I nodded. Conference room? She smiled. They're already waiting. 2 federal investigators introduced themselves with calm professionalism. No intimidation. No assumptions. One of them opened a notebook. Ms. Bennett. We understand your signature was forged. Yes. And you voluntarily reported it. I did. The other investigator leaned forward. Why now? I thought about the question. Because the truth wasn't just about one signature. It was about 34 years of silence. My mother used to tell me that every lie charges interest. I answered quietly. I finally decided to stop paying. The investigator nodded once. I understand. For the next 3 hours. I answered every question. Every document. Every transfer. Every account. Nothing hidden. Nothing exaggerated. When the interview ended, one investigator closed his notebook. You've been very cooperative. I've had years to prepare for this. He stood. One more thing. There may be additional victims. I froze. What do you mean? We've identified several former employees whose identities may also have been used. The room suddenly felt colder. This had never been only about me. That afternoon, Claire rushed into my office carrying another file. You need to see this. She placed it on my desk. A security camera still. Timestamped almost 2 years earlier. My father entering the executive records room after midnight. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was someone I recognized immediately. David Mercer. Our chief financial officer. A man who had worked beside my father for nearly 15 years. I stared at the image. No. Claire nodded slowly. He helped him. The betrayal somehow hurt almost as much. David had attended my graduation. He sent flowers after my mother died. He smiled at every company holiday party. All while helping hide millions of dollars. Claire crossed her arms. We're bringing him in this afternoon. At exactly 4 o'clock. David Mercer entered the conference room. His confidence lasted about 10 seconds. Then he saw the photograph. The forensic reports. The investigators. And me. He slowly removed his glasses. I suppose this is the part where I ask for a lawyer. Claire answered calmly. That would be wise. He looked at me instead. I'm sorry, Charlotte. Were you? He lowered his head. Richard said he was protecting the company. And you believed him? No. His voice cracked. I believed I couldn't afford to lose my job. I studied him for a long moment. Fear. Shame. Exhaustion. All visible. I signed documents I knew weren't legal. He admitted quietly. I kept telling myself I'd stop. But every year, it got worse. The investigators exchanged a glance. One of them slid a written statement across the table. David looked at it. Then at me. Finally. He signed. That single signature changed everything. Because now, someone inside my father's inner circle had officially confessed. As evening settled over Chicago, I returned to my office. The city lights flickered beyond the windows. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. Then my assistant knocked gently. Charlotte. Someone's here to see you. I don't have any appointments. I know. She hesitated. It's your brother. I looked toward the reception area. Ethan stood alone. No expensive watch. No tailored suit. No confidence. Just a tired man holding a worn brown envelope. When he entered my office, he didn't sit. I don't expect forgiveness. He said quietly. I came because there's something you don't know. He placed the envelope on my desk. Inside were handwritten journals, bank statements, and dozens of emails. My heart stopped when I recognized the handwriting. It was my mother's. Ethan looked at the floor. Mom gave these to me before she died. I stared at him in disbelief. You've had these all these years? He nodded. She told me. If Dad ever crossed the line, I was supposed to give them to you. My hands trembled as I opened the first journal. Tucked inside the front cover was a sealed envelope. Across the front, in my mother's elegant handwriting, were 6 words that changed everything. For Charlotte. When Richard finally falls. I looked up at Ethan. My voice was barely a whisper. What's inside? He swallowed hard. I never opened it. I was too afraid of what it might say. I held the envelope in my hands. Still sealed. Still waiting. For almost 10 years. I slowly slipped my finger beneath the edge. And broke the seal. For several seconds. I just held the envelope. My mother's handwriting looked exactly the way I remembered it. Neat. Patient. Certain. It was as if she had written it yesterday. Not 10 years ago. I carefully unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. The first sentence stole the air from my lungs. My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, it means your father finally chose power over his family. Tears blurred the words. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. Please don't hate him. Hold him accountable, but don't become him. The Bennett family has spent generations confusing control with love. I hoped it would end with us. If it doesn't, let it end with you. I stopped. My mother had always seen more than she ever said. She knew this day would come. She continued. Your father wasn't always this man. When we were young, he was kind. He laughed easily. He believed success would give our family security. Somewhere along the way, he started believing money was the only thing keeping us together. That's when he began losing himself. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment. I tried to imagine my father laughing. It was surprisingly difficult. Then I reached the final page. At the bottom, my mother had written one final request. When this is over, don't save the company. Save the people inside it. Employees shouldn't lose their futures because one man lost his values. I folded the letter carefully. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about responsibility. I looked at Ethan. You never read this? He shook his head. I was scared. Of what? That she'd tell me I wasn't good enough. My heart softened. For all his mistakes. He had spent his life chasing our father's approval too. Just differently than I had. The next morning, I gathered every employee in the company's main auditorium. More than 400 people filled the room. Some looked frightened. Others looked angry. Many simply looked exhausted. Rumors had spread across Chicago. People were afraid they'd lose their jobs. I stepped onto the stage. There were no cameras. No reporters. This wasn't for headlines. It was for them. I took a deep breath. My name is Charlotte Bennett. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. I know many of you are worried. I would be too. I paused. The investigation will continue. I won't interfere with it. If crimes were committed, they'll be answered for. Another pause. But let me promise you something. No one in this room will lose their job because they chose to work here honestly. Faces slowly began to change. Relief. Hope. Disbelief. Our clients will be protected. Our pensions will remain funded. Our salaries will continue. We're going to rebuild this company. The right way. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then someone near the back started clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. It wasn't applause for me. It was applause for the possibility that honesty could finally replace fear. That afternoon, Claire walked into my office smiling for the first time in days. I have news. Good or bad? Unexpected. She handed me a small envelope. The federal investigators reviewed the first phase of the evidence. I opened it. Inside was a brief letter. No evidence has been found suggesting Charlotte Bennett knowingly participated in any fraudulent activity. I quietly exhaled. For weeks, I'd carried the fear that my own reputation might never recover. Now, the truth was finally catching up. Claire leaned against the doorway. There's something else. What? Your father requested a meeting. I looked out at the Chicago skyline. What did you tell him? That I'd ask. I thought about the letter in my desk drawer. About my mother's final wish. Hold him accountable. Don't become him. After a long silence, I nodded. One meeting. Claire raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Yes. But not in my office. Where? I smiled faintly. Take him somewhere neither of us owns. The following afternoon, I arrived early at a quiet cafe overlooking the Chicago River. No security. No lawyers. Just 2 cups of coffee waiting on a small wooden table. 5 minutes later, my father walked in. For the first time in my life, he looked his age. His shoulders were lower. His hair seemed grayer. The confidence that once filled every room had quietly disappeared. He stopped beside the table. Neither of us spoke. Then, without saying a word, he slowly reached into his coat pocket and placed a single object in front of me. It was my mother's wedding ring. I've been carrying this, he said quietly, since the day she died. I looked at the ring, then back at him. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Why are you giving it to me now? His eyes filled with tears. Because it never belonged to me. It belonged to the person who kept this family together. He looked directly at me. And I finally understand. That it was never me. For the first time in 34 years. Richard Bennett wasn't asking for money. He wasn't demanding obedience. He wasn't defending himself. He was simply waiting to hear whether his daughter would answer. And I realized the hardest decision of my life had nothing to do with business anymore. I looked at my mother's wedding ring resting between us. For years, I had imagined this moment differently. I thought if my father ever apologized, the pain would disappear. It didn't. Some wounds don't vanish. They simply stop controlling your life. I picked up the ring and slipped it into my coat pocket. I accept your apology, I said quietly. But acceptance isn't the same as pretending none of this happened. My father nodded. I know. The investigation will continue. I know. If the courts decide you're responsible, you'll face the consequences. I understand. There was no argument. No negotiation. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't trying to win. He was trying to tell the truth. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I spent 30 years believing that providing for my family meant controlling them. His voice trembled. I never realized I was the one tearing us apart. I looked out at the river. I spent 30 years believing my value came from fixing everyone's problems. A small smile crossed my face. I was wrong too. We sat there for another hour. Not repairing everything. Just speaking honestly. Sometimes, that is the closest thing to healing. The months that followed were difficult. The federal investigation continued. Several executives, including David Mercer, accepted plea agreements and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. My father accepted responsibility for the financial fraud and resigned from every remaining corporate position. He never asked me to interfere. He never asked for another favor. The company survived. Not because of me alone, but because hundreds of honest employees deserved better than the choices made at the top. Together with the board, we introduced new policies. Independent financial oversight. Mandatory ethics reviews. Anonymous reporting systems. Every safeguard my mother would have wanted. Within a year, clients returned. Investors regained confidence. And Bennett Capital became known for transparency instead of fear. Ironically, the company became stronger the moment control stopped belonging to one person. As for Ethan, he sold the mansion. The sports cars. The expensive watches. Everything. He took a job managing operations for a small construction company in Wisconsin. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. One Saturday afternoon, he called me. You know what's strange? What? I sleep better now than I ever did when I was pretending to be successful. I laughed. I think that's called peace. I think you're right. We still weren't the brother and sister we'd never learned to be. But we were trying. And sometimes, trying is enough. I stayed in Maine. The cottage by the ocean slowly became home. Every Wednesday evening, the community center filled with women from every walk of life. Teachers. Nurses. Business owners. Young mothers. Retirees. Some came because they needed financial advice. Most came because they needed permission to believe their boundaries mattered. One evening, after class, a woman in her 60s waited until everyone else had left. She folded her notes and smiled. You know, I've spent 40 years saying yes because I was afraid people would stop loving me. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. Today I said no. How did it feel? She smiled through tears. Terrifying. Then she laughed. And wonderful. As she walked away, I realized my mother had been right. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or headlines. Sometimes, it sounds like one quiet word. No. Nearly 2 years after everything began, I returned to Chicago for one reason. To visit my mother's grave. The spring air carried the scent of fresh rain. I knelt beside the headstone and placed white lilies against the marble. I did my best, Mom. The wind stirred gently through the trees. I couldn't save the family. I smiled. But I saved myself. For the first time. Those words didn't feel selfish. They felt true. As I stood to leave, I noticed someone a few rows away. My father. He didn't interrupt. He simply placed fresh flowers beside her grave. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Nothing more. It was enough. Some relationships aren't rebuilt with promises. They're rebuilt with consistent actions. One honest choice at a time. Today, when people ask about my success, they usually expect me to talk about business, investments, companies, money. But that's never my answer. I tell them the greatest investment I ever made was choosing my own peace over other people's expectations. Because wealth can be stolen. Companies can fail. Reputations can recover. But the moment you stop believing your worth depends on fixing everyone else, that's the moment you become truly free. And if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. The strongest woman in the room isn't the one who sacrifices everything for her family. She's the one brave enough to love them without losing herself.